Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have queer sex educator and podcaster, Em. Join us for a conversation about healing from sexual trauma to embodying empowerment. Together, we talk about the mindfuck of doming cis-men, the subversion of role play, and the lifelong exploration of our erotic narratives. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy. I am so delighted to have all of you pleasure activists from around the world tuning in for another episode each Wednesday. And hello to all of you who are new here. My name is Nicole. I am a sex and relationship psychotherapist with training in psychedelic integration therapy. This episode was so fun to make and to edit back for all of you, dear listeners. And we do talk about Em's journey from sexual trauma. And I know, given the rates of trauma and rape culture and patriarchy, very few of us have gone through this world without experiencing some form of sexual harassment or violence. And so, as you listen to today's episode, I do want to remind you to tune into your body. Be conscious and notice how your body starts to react as you hear the story, right? I am a psychotherapist and I've been doing this work for a while now and hearing lots of different stories, and still, even editing this episode, it brought me back to my own journey with trauma, right? And it makes sense. We're going to continue to hear other people's stories, whether it's in this podcast space or out in your lived experience, and we're going to be shaped by those stories and impacted by those stories. And so tune into your body. Try to scan and notice if your chest becomes tight, if you feel something in your stomach. How can you take a couple of deep breaths to feel safe and secure again? And ultimately, this episode and story reminds me of everything that brought me into the field of psychology. After my own experience of trauma, I started volunteering as a sexual assault counselor, and that's what made me want to become a psychologist and brought me into this space. And part of what makes me excited about this work is the whole healing arc, right? We spend about the first 20-25 minutes talking about the trauma. So again, if you do want to skip past that, I invite you to forward to that point of the podcast. But I also think there's a lot of beautiful context and pieces of the story that might help you feel seen and in community, to realize that you're not the only person who has gone through these sorts of experiences. But I'm excited to be in this space to talk about that full healing arc, right? The trauma all the way to play and empowerment, and we spend the rest of the episode really getting into that and the joys. I hope it inspires you, dear listener. I hope you feel that zest and energy for life to keep exploring and to keep playing. I want all of you, dear listeners, to feel that level of empowerment, that level of play, and that level of pleasure. All right, dear listener, if you are ready to liberate your pleasure, you can explore my offerings and resources at modernanarchypodcast.com, linked in the show notes below. And a big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. You are supporting the long-term sustainability of the show, keeping the podcast free and accessible for all people. So thank you. And with that, dear listener, please know that I am sending you all of my love. And let's tune into today's episode. So then the first question I like to ask each guest is, how would you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, it's
Hi,
I
fat cat.
was gonna say my cat was literally on the desk like 5 minutes ago. So I relate to that. Yeah, it's a good question. So I go by M in this space. I identify as a queer sex educator. I identify as explorative. I identify as a creative thinker and someone who seeks self-expression and different modes of that in every kind of aspect of my life. And I think for me, that ties into my sexuality and the way that I can self-express by myself in a sexual way and with partners. And so I think that's really the lens with which I think through sex education. And from that standpoint, I've been the host of the Sexistentialist podcast now for coming up on 4 years. And for me, that's a vehicle to speak with people like you and other folks in the sex ed and sex coaching and sexuality related spaces to continue that learning journey and explore for myself kind of through that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, welcome to the space. Thank you for
Yeah,
joining all of us today. And
of
it was a
course.
pleasure to be on your podcast as well and have you
Yeah.
hold me there, and I didn't have to do any of the work.
Yes, relatable.
Yeah. So now you can let go and trust that
I
I will hold
know.
you in this space.
It's been a while since I've recorded for someone else's show. I'm like off duty. It's
I
weird.
know. It feels good, doesn't
Yeah, it's
it?
strange. I'm like, I can just drink my coffee and have a conversation.
Yes, you
Crazy.
can. I got you. I got you. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming into the
Yeah.
space. I know that, today we'll be talking a little bit about your own personal journey with
Yeah.
sexuality and play. And yeah, where do you want to start that story? I'd love for you to take the time and really take up the space to share with me and all of the listeners, your journey to connecting with play.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, like most people, my journey started in adolescence. I
Mhm.
mentioned I identify as queer. That's the word I prefer to use. If pressed, I will use pansexual. Some folks really want like a specific label and to understand what sexuality looks like for others, and I get that. So that's the term I'll use if I have to, but generally just identify as queer. I grew up in Texas and had a very specific lens to sexuality that
Mm,
was driven by society's influence as a result of that, but
yeah.
did have super open and progressive parents. My mom was a swinger for
Cool.
a number of years. Yeah. And that was something I didn't know about as much, obviously, when I was young. But when it got to a
Yeah.
point where I was early adolescence, she was kind of open with me about some of what that looked like for her. And frankly, even before I knew that about her, she was always really accessible. So she ensured that like I had pretty well-rounded sex ed, and
Mm,
there were questions that I found didn't get answered by sex ed. Obviously, everyone struggles with that. I luckily was put in a program hosted by a nonprofit outside of my school. It's actually the program through which I educate youth now. And so
mm,
that's clearly resonating with me because I circled back to it in my adulthood. But, it answered a lot of the right questions, but there were still so many questions to be had around pleasure. So I, asked her a lot of those questions. I said, Mom, I understand what an orgasm for a penis owner looks like. I understand like the purpose of ejaculation, but like no one's really telling me what that looks like for a vulva owner. Like, what am I
mm,
supposed to be expecting? Like, what's the goal here, quote unquote goal?
mhm.
And she did a really good a job of unpacking what that looks like anatomically, and also that like pleasure can take a lot of forms, and that it's
Yeah.
okay to kind of live in the question. That's sort of a phrase with which she thinks about life, is like living in the question. And so that really drove me to explore and be open-minded. But I think, like with anyone who grew up, particularly in the US and particularly in certain states, there was, of course, some shame and some stuff that I've had to unpack from a sexuality standpoint, and sort of what my role, particularly as a cis woman, what my perceived role was by some of my
Mhm.
partners, particularly my cis male partners.
Mm, mhm.
So there was that, a little bit of a content warning for folks tuning in. But when I was in high school, I was sexually assaulted by someone I knew and trusted. And honestly,
Mm,
that's really what took me on a journey of exploring, in particular, various kink communities and kink play. In part, I think of a search for a reclamation of autonomy and agency. Does that mean that I ended up in a lot of unsafe situations as someone who hadn't initially educated themselves about what kink and safe kink exploration should look like? Absolutely. And there's a lot of trial and error to be had there, but that's sort of what led to my being part of the community, and then a desire to educate people in hopes of harm reduction and, having people understand what a safe explorative journey can look like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for
Yeah.
trusting me in the space to open up about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And I'm in a place where it's not that it's easy to talk about, but like I did the work, right? And that's
Right.
for anyone listening who has experienced something traumatic or violating. I always say like you do have to do the work. And you obviously know in your firsthand experience career-wise
Mm-hmm,
that there's a
mm-hmm.
lot of work to be done. So I always feel like I talk about therapy or some form of self-care
Sure.
like all the time in the show because it's like you got to do the work.
Yeah.
It's hard, but it's important.
Right. And I don't know if the work ends, right? That's
True.
you know,
Yeah.
like you feel like you've done it and then there's like somehow randomly something that comes up and you're like, "Oh, it's still there." But I
Yeah.
feel like the space between how often that happens changes, right?
Yes.
What you were saying earlier too, not just that experience in high school, but the ways that even gender roles or
Yeah.
expectations and shame in the culture. I mean, we're talking about different types and levels of various traumas, right? That
Yeah, totally.
societally we're always deconstructing. So it's like it's still always here.
Yes,
Oh
for
yeah,
sure.
yeah. But a journey nonetheless.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, I'm curious, going back to the time in high school, I can only
Yeah.
imagine, starting a little bit there, how hard it was for you to have that with someone that you trusted a lot.
Hmm.
Take me back to that journey of what it meant to like reconnect to your body, reconnect
Yeah.
to trust at that point in your life.
Yeah, and it took me a really long time to really even address it. So
Mm,
at the time of the assault, I was in a relationship with someone else.
mm,
I tried to be open with that person about what had happened, and they were not
mm,
responsive,
mm,
which that inability to receive my situation, which again, I understand now in hindsight, like I was a child in a situation with another child, basically.
yeah.
And that inhibited me from addressing it really with anyone else. So I didn't talk about it for a really long time.
Oof, yeah.
In a classic college situation, I got drunk at a party and told my best friend. So,
Mm,
and she
mhm,
she then later was like, "Hey, not sure your call, but you did in fact, disclose this to me."
mm,
And I didn't know how much it impacted me. I mean,
mm,
and I had had other situations in my life that had posed difficulty, so I wasn't unfamiliar with mental illness, and I wasn't unfamiliar with some of the symptoms of panic disorder and depression and some other stuff, right? But when I was kind of post sexual assault,
mhm,
there were a lot of things that came up as side effects of not processing that I had no idea where to place, right? So like
mm,
I developed a really, really difficult relationship to my body, for example,
mm,
and more so than I had before. Obviously, again, I'm a young millennial, so living in a world where like social media was really coming to fruition as I was going into college and like
mhm,
thinking about, and a little bit towards the end of my high school, I guess, but thinking about the impact that that had on body image, and then thinking about the fact that for a while it felt really clear that my body didn't belong to me.
yeah,
So yeah, I faced a lot of difficulty around that I didn't realize was related, right? And
sure.
so I thought I had some other stuff going on. I tried to unpack it, didn't have the right mental health professional supporting me through that.
Mm,
And I kind of ditched therapy and started turning to experiences, I guess I would say, around me to try to explore what rediscovering bodily autonomy looks like. And it,
yeah,
like I said, took some pretty unhealthy forms. I surrounded myself with people who were not super healthy for me. And I started exploring sexually in a way that was, I would say, pretty unsafe, just because I think my mentality around it was so much about having a negative view on my
mm,
body and my role in this world. And I didn't know where to put all of that emotion and energy.
sure.
But I really didn't process in earnest my sexual assault until like 7 years after.
Mm,
It's been several years since then, but it took me that long to actually go to a therapist and unpack some other stuff for sure, but say like, this is something I haven't addressed. And I know it's impacting everything else. And that's when I started putting the pieces together of like, oh shit, a lot of what I've been up to the last 7 years is because of this.
So it really took that time from the event to be able to go back into it.
For sure. Yeah. And, some people do need that time. You know what I mean? It looks processing trauma. And again, you see this, and I'm sure you see how varied it can be. It takes a lot of different forms. And it can take a lot of different timelines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so like ditching therapy to explore experimentally, like what did that look like? Because I mean, yeah, there's a lot where I think therapy can fail in terms of, it's so much of the cognitive experience and the narrative of the processing, which is great, but there's the actual experiential pieces of it.
Yeah.
Learning there. I'd be curious, what did that look like? I know you mentioned it was unsafe at the time.
Yeah. So I entered into like a romantic dynamic with a person who I knew had, when you're in college, like rumors get around. I entered in a relationship with someone I had been told had not been the kindest partner to other women. Someone who definitely had some untreated mental illness and some serious substance abuse problems. So those elements were things like drugs and alcohol, which I think can and should be used effectively. And we've talked about this for, your episode of my show. There are so many positive ways that certain drugs can be used therapeutically,
Right.
whether in a medical setting or not. But
Right.
this was like a self-medication that was not effective for me, one, and two, I think leading to some additional like non-consensual situations, because I think I was putting myself in situations where I couldn't consent. And I ended up exploring basically a cuckolding dynamic with this person. And any form of open relationship or ethical non-monogamy can be super interesting and super validating for a lot of people. Obviously, we talked about that with your experience as well on my show.
Yeah.
And it can be so fulfilling and like far better for some folks than trying to, fit themselves into a monogamous box. But again, I was in a relationship with someone who was not healthy for me.
Right.
And so I basically was coerced into a cuckold dynamic. And I ended up having zero agency over what that looked like. And so, whereas normally when you think about a cuck dynamic, you've got like that quote unquote hot wife who is through things like joint experiences or separate non-monogamous experiences and like subsequent degradation, humiliation. Like there's usually some control given to the hot wife as to what this looks like. And the cuck is, from a submissive standpoint, like consenting to it, and they've negotiated what that degradation or humiliation, if those are elements of it, can look like. And usually, again, though, the hot wife has some agency. And it turned out that I was really kind of being told when I could and couldn't like leave the house or see other people, my other partners. Got to a point where I was really manipulated in situations where the person that I believed myself to be in love with at the time was using me for a dynamic that I hadn't really consented to. And I was clinging to the validation and affirmation that I could get through the use of my body with other people. So I was ending up too, and again, like a lot of my partners in that non-monogamous dynamic were actually really nice, and eventually were like, hey, I feel like maybe the dynamic you have with your partners like great. But yeah, I put myself in a lot of situations where I was engaging in sexual encounters with people like out of spite, or because it was like the only method of affection I felt like I was getting from anyone, or it was sort of like the mentality was like, well, this is what I'm good for, so let me just use my body because that's all I've got. That should never be the mentality, right? Like, if you want to be degraded, power to you. If you want to feel objectified in a consensual situation, then like, fuck yeah, go for it. You want to map a scene with some of those elements in play. Like, I love and empower those situations. But for me, my mentality was anything but that. And so I had to rebuild my relationship with kink as well after all of that, because so much of it was, I have to do this because it's all I have going for me. And it's the only way that anyone's acting like I'm worth anything. It's just like, oh, heavy topic for everyone on this episode. Sorry. But it's,
yeah, you're in the right space.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
but yeah, like my mentality was broken, right? And
Yeah.
I had still was not connecting the dots that this was tied to my sexual assault.
Yeah.
And I also, it was around the time that I moved to Chicago. So I was isolated from the
Mm,
support system who had
totally.
been aware of what had happened to me. But yeah, I made some unhealthy choices and picked some unhealthy people. And part of that was like with purpose as well, which is
Hmm.
not good. Yeah,
Yeah. 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 And the reality is you were doing your best at the time, right? Weren't we
totally.
all, weren't we all, right? Weren't we
Seriously.
all? We were
Fuck.
just, like shit, like this is how I get love. This is how I get
Hmm.
validation. I think that maps onto a lot of my own personal journey of like going through
Mm.
an assault and then like feeling like
Yeah.
this was the one way I could secure this partner was to keep
Yeah.
going back. And so I think there's so much compassion to have when we look back on these younger parts of ourselves or these younger aspects of our history.
Yeah.
And I think it's sometimes wild to hold the like lack of consciousness we had at that time and what we were
Yeah.
doing, right? And then that being the big shift between what you're talking about of like playing with kink in a conscious way of like, oh, I
Yeah.
actively want to be degraded for fun
Yeah.
rather than this is the only way I can secure love is by being degraded, right? Like
Yeah.
those are radically different things. And I mean, a lot of what I think about in terms of the psychedelic work and drugs in
Mm.
general is like what's the relationship, like kink is its own form of a drug, right? Like you get
Yeah.
that adrenaline, you get that high, and it's not like the drug is bad, it's like what's your relationship to it. If the only way that you can feel happy at a party is through a drug,
Yeah.
maybe we have an interesting relationship to explore,
Yep.
right? You know what I mean? So it's like
Totally.
it's not the thing itself as much as it is our relationships to it, right? Or even like the set and setting of the psychedelic of non-monogamy, right?
Yeah.
Like if
Totally.
your set and setting is not a great space that the partner is there, then you're gonna have a horrible trip. You'll learn a
Totally.
lot in that bad
Yeah.
trip, but like whoa, so
Yeah.
it's just so hard, I think, when we think about those like past versions of ourselves. And as you were talking, like I just felt this like strong desire to like give you a hug at that younger
Thank you.
point. You
I
know what I
know.
mean? Of just like,
Yeah.
oh, baby.
I know. Truly a baby.
Ugh.
And that was part of the resentment I had around it as well.
Mm,
And
sure.
I don't know how old you were at the instance of your assault, but like for me,
Yeah.
even though I was 17 and
Hmm.
I had been sexually active and I to an extent, obviously not quite as much as I have since then, but
Sure. Yeah.
sure, yeah. But I felt like my childhood had been robbed.
Mm,
Like you know what I mean? Like
yeah.
as an adult, when I started thinking about this, like fuck, like I wasted. It felt like I had wasted years holding on to this when I could have been having fun, right? I mean, like that when I could have been
Mm,
learning or having that learning mindset that I have now, as opposed to the like punishing mindset.
yeah.
And like I'm so grateful still for the lived experience because I think every decision I made after that led me to where I am now and
Yeah.
having this really healthy relationship that I do with kink and not that we don't have all have our bad days, but generally speaking with my body
Yeah.
and like my body's capability for pleasure. But
Mm.
God, it made me so angry for so long.
Uh,
And that was part of what I had to unpack as well. It's just like the residual frustration about what I could have had instead, even though, I have everything that I could possibly want now. So it's like
right.
there's a lot to, yeah, a lot to deal with. And I think there are some parts of it that I am glad I experienced. Again, I think learning and making those mistakes, like you said, like you can have a bad trip and like that sucks. There are learnings from it,
Yeah,
which
there
like are
are.
maybe the silver lining. And I feel like that's maybe what
Yeah.
I unpacked. But I also think like I had a lot of like questions for myself when I finally got out of the situation I was in and
Hmm.
that those dynamics. And did stay friends with some of my partners outside of my sort of primary partner after that. And, those relationships I think were healed and I think that helped. But a lot of it is I had been put by society and my trauma and my partner since like trauma into this like very traditionally submissive box.
Mm.
You know what I mean? It was like you have to be a submissive.
Mm.
Basically, which then was like questioned during the cuckolding dynamic where it was like, well, am I submissive or am I the dom here?
Hmm.
And I struggled with what the dynamics were in relationship to like how I was being perceived or treated. And post all of that, like I'm 100% a switch. Like
Mm.
it's like I will very happily take full control and dom a partner. But I also still have learned and healed my relationship with being submissive and relinquishing
Sure.
control. And that was difficult. But I never even thought that I could be outside of the submissive box because like as a cis woman growing up in the South in particular, it was like there's a patriarch, and everything I do is sort of to please the patriarch,
No, totally.
or be part of that patriarchal structure.
Yeah.
So that was cool and like a shift for me that I discovered in adulthood.
I'm excited to talk about this.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah. Yes. Particularly within an American context, right? We're based on puritanical values,
Yes.
Christianity. The woman submits to the authority of the man. That is deeply
Yes.
interlaced within the history of this country and our culture. And so I think that sort of messaging is all around us. Like it's hard for me to think of even like, a movie of a strong, powerful woman who has her
Yeah.
sexual agency and control. Like we just don't see enough of those narratives when we know that
Totally.
we're social beings and we look to other narratives of how to live our life and we're lacking this. Again, it goes back to those roots. So yeah, especially growing up in Texas, right? Growing up
Yeah.
in a Christian society, the idea of being dominant, was never a possibility.
Yeah.
So what I find interesting is how our sense of self is, we're always looking internally, like, who am I? Who am I? And it's like psychology always talks about how, our sense of self is created by all of our relationships, right?
Mm.
Including our relationships to society, nature, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like when we're asking ourselves, like, who am I? Oh, I'm a sub. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, your whole world has painted that mirror. This is how
Yeah.
people view you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you start to shift those relationships, you become, connected to other empowered women. You start to
Yes.
have conversations. You start to go, oh, wait, there's another world that's possible. And then
Yeah.
you step into this other side of yourself, right? This dawn, this powerful self. And it's kind of interesting, I think, that like psychological search for identity and the ways that that shifts as you grow into your empowerment. Because if we would,
Yes.
same here, right? Where it was like easier first to step into a dom or a sub role, much
Yeah.
harder to switch into a dom role. And it's like, what does that say about our psyche?
Yes.
In ways that I don't want to shame people who are in one or the other, but it's
For
really
sure.
interesting to think about how, like, in our own journeys, the actual psychological development of like outside areas of our life directly impacted
Yes.
that role, and it's like, oh,
Totally.
we gotta talk about that.
Well, the first time I started exploring being more dominant was with women, right? With
Exactly.
yes, right. And so I was like, oh
Exactly.
fuck, I'm a top question mark. I was like, wait, pillow princess if there's a dick present, but like what's going on here? And that's when it was like, okay, so
Yep.
what's my perception of other cis women?
Yep.
Right? Because it's like, okay, well, I see them in the role that they've been prescribed, but I'm also defying the role that I've been prescribed. Like let's explore and unpack that. And then what was really, really empowering to me, again, one, because I enjoyed the sexual experience, but also because of what I was unpacking from a societal standpoint, was the first
Mm-hmm.
time that I was dominant over a cis man,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And I was like, damn, this is wild. Like, this is like, I'm having a mind-blowing experience right now,
Yeah.
because it's one thing to feel like you have control over a situation, and it's another thing to feel dominant in a situation, right? Or to
Mhm.
take on a role of authoritarianism, something
Mhm.
that we live within a construct of, so much of the time. And so, yeah, I mean, it opened doors for me and also challenged me. There were times where I talked to my cis male partner and I was like, what's going on here? Like, is this weird? And again, I'm so open-minded, and like there's nothing that anyone could ever tell me that they've done in bed and me be like, that's strange. I might be like, oh, that's a different flavor than what I've experienced, but like I want to hear more about it. Like I just come from, as long as everyone is safe and consenting,
Right.
I'm for it, right?
Right.
Like as long as there's safety measures in place, regardless of what it is. Like I'm pretty open-minded. But I was like, is this exploration, is this breaking of gender roles a problem? Or does it mean like I need to explore like my gender identity? Like, does it have to be something that like challenges my identity? And I unpacked that no, it doesn't. But I'm
Right.
allowed to take on different roles that
Yeah.
don't prescribe to what I've been raised into. I mean, it was like it was a mind fuck. It really
Oh,
was.
totally.
And it took some time. And, I have a very cool as a cucumber partner. So he was like, nah, like we're exploring and we're having fun and like we're communicating about it. And it doesn't have to be like an identity crisis. He didn't say it that
Right.
way, but
Right.
he was like, you don't have to panic. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't like something, you don't like it. If you like it, let's explore it. And I was like, yeah, that's fair enough. Like that can
Mhm.
be it. I don't have to add the like cherry on top of, oh fuck, what are the implications of this from like a societal standpoint?
Totally,
But yeah,
totally. I mean, there's so much packed up in there, right? Like the
yes.
second that I'm like, ooh, like I really want to do this or that with someone, people have come back to me and say like, oh, you sound like a man. And I'm like, what?
You're like,
Like,
let's unpack that.
yeah, because I have ownership over my sexuality and I'm
Yeah.
like erotically charged and I want to do things like that's interesting, right? And then the first time that you start to wear a strap on, right? And you're like,
Yes.
does this make me a man? And like, to me, no, I am a
Yeah.
woman, right? Like, and it doesn't
I
have
feel
to
that way.
have that, like, I think that again, because there's not this larger, where do I see an example of this? Where do I
Yeah.
see an example of someone like swinging a dildo and being like, I'm totally a woman up in my power, right?
Yep.
Like I just don't have models of that, right? So then you just go down this like deep spiral of what does all of this mean? And you're right, it doesn't have to mean anything. It
Yeah.
can obviously mean everything to someone, but it doesn't have to, right? And so that
Yeah.
ability to play, I mean, it is I think it's a psychedelic experience as we shatter truly the
Yeah.
gender roles about what it means to be a woman and to be empowered, to be dominant, to lead in ways that society has previously said were quote unquote masculine traits.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the roles of masculinity and femininity in everything are absolutely fascinating. I
Yeah.
have such a frustration with the not I mean the notions of masculinity and femininity are built into our society. I think that without, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, without a complete upheaval of those concepts, right, we have to run with them for what they are. And for me, if I want to play a stereotypically masculine role in a given situation, that I have the right to do so. And I have the right to take empowerment from that because I do live in a world where masculinity is treated as the role of empowerment or the role of strength, right? And so you mentioned strap-ons. Like, yes, I like to wear a strap-on because having a dick gives me a sense of power because I live in a society where penis ownership is associated in so many contexts, not every context, but in so many, with authority, right? That doesn't mean I want an actual penis. Quite happy having a vulva. Think it's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something to that. Like, yes, I like a toy itself, but also maybe I like having a penis because of the implications that society tells me it has, right? From an empowerment standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not easy to just jump to that conclusion, right? Sometimes like, fuck, like, do I like having a penis because I want to be packing all the time? No, I just want to wear a strap on and play.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to do it every time, but I like it when it's there, you
Right.
know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you were speaking, I could like hear Freud being like the penis envy. And
I
I'm just like, yeah, Freud, I don't know. It's nice to just put it on and take it off when I want to.
Yeah, like I'm good not having one all the time.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm good not having one all the time. Yeah. But there's something to that, like
Yeah.
the weird play my like I can imagine. It's like the Stanford prison
Mhm.
experiment. Like you're put in a situation of authority, right? And suddenly
Totally.
you take on those traits. I feel like if I wore a strap on enough, I'd be like I'd be an asshole, right?
Yeah.
Because I take on traits and I'm like, some men behave, right? Like,
It's hilarious. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. I mean, yeah, I mean, there's just so many ways to play with it. I think,
Yeah.
like what we're saying is like, can we like enjoy these aspects for the play that they are and the role play, right? Exactly. Like
Yes.
it's hilarious too, in my opinion. Like I was joking on another episode how like I feel like I've gone off such the I don't want to say deep end, but the fun end of all of the types of beings in play of like
Yeah.
doming and etc. Where like being like a trad wife has been a hilarious role play of like
I love
sorry,
that.
is that I don't think it's messed up. I
No, no,
mean
no, it's
they're all
not. It's not.
like they're all different roles to play and I love to play the like housewife that whatever.
No, but it's a subversion of that facet of our
Totally.
society, which I fucking love.
Right? Like it's hilarious to play
Yeah.
in that when you play so much in the dom and the powerful and the that, it's
Yes.
like, okay, I gotta go back to the other of like, oh no,
Yeah, for sure.
And I think the same thing is possible with like, oh yeah, playing like a man. Like I want to be the quote
Yeah.
unquote man of society. These are all different, like psychoanalytic theory would always say like archetypes, right? The
Yes.
archetype of the mother, the blah, blah, blah. So it's like these are all different roles that we can play into, and many of us play every day without
Yeah,
awareness of, right? But
totally.
you can get this level of awareness to it and then like, oh, okay, cool. Like which, part of myself do I want to tap into? What role do I want to play out here? And then like, I don't know about you, but like half the time I'm giggling in between orgasms. You know
Yes.
what I mean?
Yeah,
It's like
for sure. Yeah. And I also feel like if you're not laughing at some point during sex, like what are you up to? But
totally.
like sex is so weird and messy and silly and like all the best ways. Like I think it should be. But
Mhm.
no, I'm obsessed with that. But like the idea of playing like really traditional just because like it is a subversion. Like why not reclaim the role that we've been prescribed to?
Yeah, it's funny. But then I start to go so deep with it. It's like I'm playing with one of my partners who's a man, and I'm
Yeah.
just like, you never help out with the kids. Like all you do is watch sports, and I feel so unsupported. It immediately just evolves.
Yeah. No, I love it. I have a pretty big nerd in
Yeah.
terms of like D&D and
Oh,
cosplay and
there it is. Yep.
LARPing. Yeah,
Yep.
I'm part of the nerd communities. I think that's a fun way to incorporate, obviously, if you have a fantasy mindset in
Yep.
general, it's easier to integrate some of those, I think, into the bedroom without it being like kooky. Like I have like every time I come home from a Comic-Con, it's like, are we gonna fucking cosplay?
I
Yeah,
love
why not?
that.
Like, might as well just kick it off.
Yeah.
While we're here, might as well.
Yeah.
But I a lot of my social media algorithm around that are there's like a massive overlap on Instagram between those
Hmm.
communities and like the book talk community or bookstagram community. So I see a lot of what I perceive on social media as being like pretty traditional heteronormative relationships, and it's always really funny to me. I watch these reviews of like women giving their partners or husbands like one of their like fantasy smut books, and the men like read and react,
Mm,
and the men are like, you like this? Like this is so weird. And to me it's like PG-13, maybe R-rated, but just like compared to the
totally.
stuff that you see in kink and fetish communities. And
Yeah.
I laugh about it. And then I'm like, but there's also something like innocent about that dynamic that
Yeah.
is interesting to explore from a sexual standpoint. Like, anyway, not that I'm getting off to people on Bookstagram talking about fairy books, but it poses the question to me a lot about, is there something to be said about playing into that like quote unquote innocence
Hmm.
and role playing the open-mindedness that can come from having your first kink or fetish experience like for the first time, and like role playing that, not a stereotypical dom and sub relationship, but like more of the virgin role. When you said the mother, that's what I
Yeah.
was thinking of.
Yeah.
And to me, yeah, maybe it comes from a position of having been in a sexual trauma situation, but there's something to me about the innocence before all that happened that I'm like, that's kind of a fun play.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
I
I
definitely
just
go there.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
internet is such a weird place to take reference from, but I do. I look at people's
totally.
dynamics on the internet. I'm like, God, that's interesting. What
For
would that be like?
sure, for sure. I think coming from purity culture, it's such a fun place to play with. I should talk about like again, when we're talking about healing from trauma, we know that we've healed from trauma when we're able to play with these things and have
Yes.
fun with them, right? So there's a
Yeah.
lot of fun for me in being like, oh, I've never done this before. Oh
Yeah.
no. I've never, oh God. So I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of play in that, which is such a great space. But so much of this, like you said, is like culture. I feel like the
Yeah.
deeper you get into like kinky, queer, open relating culture, you kind of like look back at the things that like other people are like, oh my God. And you've just
Yeah.
realized how deeply you've gotten into the culture that those things feel like PG-13, what? You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
then I think like even like when I'm thinking about like dating partners, like part of this game is like assessing where someone's at culturally with
Yes.
sexuality because they may be in their 40s, but culturally, depending on maybe where they came from, they may have such a lack of experience around that like you do have to treat that like a new a new little baby coming up into this
Yeah,
world,
for
truly.
sure.
Like, I can't just
Yeah.
drop my craziest scene on you without being like, oh, this is gonna make you go into a wild headspace.
Yes, might break your brain,
Yeah,
but it'll be
exactly.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I went to a wedding a couple months ago. My best friend got married and there were other people at the wedding who like I had heard of and but hadn't met. So I spent a lot
Hmm.
of time getting to know new people, but in a pretty intimate context. And one of the other people kind of in the wedding was like, I love being in like kinky spaces. Like very much was
Yeah.
like, yeah, I'm in a bunch of kinky spaces in my city. And
Hmm.
she lives across country. And then I was like, yeah, well, I do this podcast and I
Hmm.
teach sex ed, so like I'm kind of aware of what that might look like. And she's like, "Oh, are you kinky?" Like that was the question, which is so funny to me because I don't know if anyone's ever been like, "Are you like so are you kinky?" And
Mm.
I mean it was like, "Well, yeah." But then after my partner was like, "Yeah, I guess so." And I was like, "Well, the shit we do is definitely considered within the
Ah!
bounds of kink." But it part of that I think is his mentality, right? To your
Yeah,
point, like the culture with which he entered our sexual relationship or the history of his own sexual experiences for him, what is deemed as I don't want to use the word normal, but when I say it is like when we do what is deemed outside of like the stereotypical mainstream sex act,
hmm,
the mentality is we're exploring.
yeah,
Bodies are used for pleasure, and we're expanding upon what that looks like compared to some of what we were fed growing up, right? And but yeah, like if someone asks, yeah, those are the things that we do are considered within the realms of kink and or fetish. But it was
hmm,
like it was a funny conversation for him and I to have because we just don't talk about it like that within
totally.
our own dynamic.
Right. Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's culturally laden, right? And like, yeah, if
Yes.
the idea of kink is like the not quote unquote non-normative, and you
Yeah.
ask, okay, what's the normative? And then like that shifts for people. You know
For
what I
sure.
mean? Like
Yeah.
some people like a threesome is just their everyday Tuesday. Like who cares? Like I do this all the time. Wait, three,
Yeah.
four, five? Like what are you talking about? How many? You
Yeah,
know?
literally.
Versus
Yeah.
some other like people where that is like truly mind blowing. And so
Yes.
the reference point of whatever normal is then creates the opposite of AKA kink, right?
Yes.
So then it's like, but what's wild to me though is if we go back to like the concepts of patriarchy and power and control, first off, when I hear Christians say, I need to submit to the authority of my husband,
Mm-hmm.
everything goes through my head about that. I'm like, whoa, what about, wow, that's a power dynamic that
Yeah.
you're choosing, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know,
Maybe,
like
yeah.
and once you go down that rabbit hole of can you choose based on your societal context, I think it means all of us can't choose, you know what I mean? Like truly we're
Yes.
always in our society. So can I ever freely choose? Big question. Interesting. But like the ways that so many of us are playing with power through gender roles of the man comes in and is controlling the scene and I'm just swept off my feet as the woman, like that is power play. Yeah.
Yes.
You know what I
Yes.
mean? And so like getting people to see that I think is a part of this
Yeah.
discussion.
I think everything is power play. And like maybe from my perspective, I'm undermining. I mean, there are definitely situations you can craft scenes you can build with a partner that are distinctly, this is a power play scene.
Right.
But I also just think the infrastructure of our day-to-day life is grounded in power play. From a work standpoint, from when I take the bus, what the power dynamics are on public transportation. Like everything is a little bit about what role we play and who's in charge, right? Or who we perceive to be in charge. And everyone will have a different perception as to who's in charge, depending on their cultural background and the way that they feel about their fit in society. So it looks different for everyone. But yeah, like, and again, maybe I'm undermining the concept of power play, but in my mind, everything I do comes with some kind of power dynamic, and it's how I respond to and perceive that power dynamic that either inhibits or makes space for my own happiness, right, in that situation. But it's also, I think, so important to be aware of some of those power dynamics in obviously societal context, but sexuality as well, because I think they can be unspoken. So
Yeah.
unless you go out of your way to craft a really specific scene, there's always going to be potentially the taint of an unwanted power dynamic at play, even if you're in a healthy dynamic. But I think, empowering, or at least it has been for me, to explore what that looks like and to push the boundaries of my own power in a situation. And that's taken forms with different partners, right? And, there are situations where like maybe I've been more financially stable than a partner, and that's a power
Yes,
dynamic,
it is.
for sure, especially in the capitalist world that we live in, right? But
Mm-hmm.
maybe I'm physically smaller, physically weaker. Maybe I'm physically bigger, physically stronger, and those are power dynamics. It's
Mm-hmm.
everything. But I think there has to be a level of awareness. I do think that the traditional puritanical structure of a woman submits to a man seeks to stifle the unspoken power dynamics. My grandparents are, I think, a really interesting example. They both have passed away over the last several years, but they were in a relationship from the age of 15 and 17 to, the day my grandfather died at the age of
Wow.
88. And they loved each other very deeply, and they had a beautiful relationship. But my grandfather was a pastor in Texas, and my grandmother was the daughter of a pastor in Texas. So it
Mm.
was very stereotypical evangelical purity culture in the South. And my grandmother submitted to my grandfather in a very dutiful way, but she wore the quote unquote pants in that marriage. Like, she was by far the more outspoken, the more opinionated, I think even like the smarter, not
Yeah.
that, yeah, I don't want to like say that like intelligence is like an effective measurement of like power, but it can be like, he was very
Mm-hmm.
academically driven. She had the street smarts and the common sense, right? And so in
Mm-hmm.
so many ways, I think about what her life could have been had she not
Oof.
had to subscribe to that submission, because God, I think she could have done anything. She set her mind to. But
Yeah.
she taught elementary school, and then she retired, and she was a wife. Like, her role was a wife. So it's interesting to think about, when you don't acknowledge it, what gets lost along the way.
Yeah. I think it's hard sometimes when I think about those like examples of relationships, where it's like, yeah, they met at 15 and they lived their whole life, and people will uphold that as an example of how monogamy works and thrives. And it's really hard for me because if you look at the history of everything
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, okay, so that women couldn't have credit cards in America until like 1972. So she had
Yep.
no financial liberation to live out on her own. And then like the scarier one, right? Like marital rape wasn't illegal until like 1997 or something in
Yeah.
all 50 states. It was very recent. And so then we're thinking like, okay, so like even ownership over your own body, like your husband could rape you. And so then you're just like, wow, is this really the sign of romance? Like when we look back to these
Right.
examples, and then like based on the data we have now of the orgasm gap, right? So now you're thinking,
Yeah.
God, like let's go back even a little bit further. What was the gap like at that point? You know what I mean? And like
Yeah.
it's just like women weren't as aware. We didn't have this collective, internet to actually talk and have these conversations that were so taboo back then, So like part of me is just like, God, like like we look
Yeah.
to that as an example, and it's like I don't know if we should, you know what I mean, given like the
Yeah.
lack of ownership and the problematic ways that pleasure was shut off for women's bodies. It's like we can't really
Yes.
look to that piece. There's been so much liberation for women in the last like 50 years. It hasn't even been 100 years, like we're just like at such a big turning point, I think, for what the future of relationships look like now that women have the money to get a car, have the money to
Yes.
buy their own fucking house and live their own life how they want to live. We're in a
Yes.
different time.
It is a new world. Like, the
Yeah.
way that things look now is so different. And I want everyone to have the agency, autonomy, and access to choosing their own adventure. And I've been really lucky in having that. I put in a lot of fucking work, and I'm still doing the work, and it's not been easy. But I did end up in a situation with a partner who gives me the autonomy and agency to explore myself to the fullest and make those challenges, right, of my role and the world around me in general, and embraces that, right? Not everyone has that. And I know a lot of people in dynamics where one of them seeks to challenge some of this and the other one is happy not challenging it. I think that's difficult too, whether or not they know it. And again, that's my outside perspective, but having those questions and pushing the envelope is important to growth. That's how we've gotten to the growth that we've made as a society
Hmm.
so far.
Right, right. And like you said, in different areas of the conversation, like in terms of stepping into like a dom energy, it's uncomfortable to shatter
Yeah.
these pieces. It reminds me a lot of when I was first in Christianity and starting to step out, right? Like it was like, oh God, like what is a world without God?
Yeah.
And as you start to step out of that, that paradigm still like is steeped so deeply in an unconscious way where like I would make decisions and be like, well, what if this is not in line with the spirit? Like, what would God say? Right. Like, even though I
Hmm.
was like, no, I'm done with this, still like years afterwards, it would like creep in. Oh, did you just use the Lord's name in vain? Like, oh God, it's like, fuck,
Yeah.
I don't want to be in this paradigm, but it comes back. Right. And I think that that's been a lot of my own journey, right? Is like, I, I'm fucking non-monogamous, and then I'll like meet one person and be like, well, what if this is the one and I should drop
Right.
everything that I've built and like we could get married and run off and oh my God. And it's like, Nicole, you've built a whole empire. Like, what are
Yeah.
you like, like why is this coming in? And it's that
Yeah.
same reality that like when we've been socially conditioned, we can call them intrusive thoughts,
Yeah.
CBT, whatever we want to call them. These thoughts of our previous paradigm are going to come up, especially if it's the society we live in. And so everywhere I see these rom-coms, this and that of like the one, the myth of the one and all of this stuff. And so it's like, of course, these thoughts are going to come back. And so it's never, for me, it has never been the smooth ride. I've been like, I'm done with Christianity, I'm out. And then just
Yeah.
like smooth sailing. No, it has been fucking rock
Yeah.
climbing again and again. It's
Yeah.
hard.
It is really hard. And it's writing that line between like, am I having these intrusive thoughts, if you want to use that phrase, or
Yeah.
is it a reclamation and a subversion, right? And so like I
Hmm.
love that you're maybe your intent isn't to combat one with the other, but I do love this idea of someone combating those intrusive thoughts with a I'm gonna role play as the trad wife, right? Like I'm gonna
Mm.
reclaim that role
Yeah.
in a
Playful.
non-traditional, yeah,
Yeah.
in a play role. So that way it is a reclamation. And same thing, like I never kind of thought I was going to get legally married. I am legally married for a
Hmm.
lot of reasons. That was the path I chose to take. For a long time, I never thought I would. There are things I have done to kind of reframe my thoughts on marriage,
Yeah.
but I sometimes I like being a wifey, right? Like
Sure.
sometimes I wake up and I'm like, today I'm going to be wifey energy.
Hmm.
And I have found ways to feel good and loving and happy about that dynamic without it being like, oh God, am I just doing this because like society
Sure.
told me I had to? And also one of the things for me is I'm consciously child free. Part of that is for me, like I got married for again a lot of different reasons, but when I had the realization that I could be married without the implication of having children, because for so long I thought that that was the only option, I felt this huge weight come off my back. And
Mm.
so now when people are like, are you sure? Like, what if you change your mind? I'm like, oh no, you weren't there in my body the day I had the realization. I
Yeah.
felt the realization and my
Yeah.
soul like experienced the joy and relief at realizing that my body could serve other purposes and only other
Hmm.
purposes.
Hmm.
That it's like I can have fun with this notion of being wifey without
Yeah.
the absolute horror of, oh fuck, that means I have to bear someone's
Right.
children.
Right.
Or I have to be a submissive role. And that's part of it too, is like I can be whatever role I want. It just so happens
Hmm.
that I am married.
Right. And it's all about the choice to do that. It's all about the
Yeah.
choice and the freedom
Yeah.
to do that and make that world. And, like from a psychology standpoint, we're always creating narratives up in our head. Our narrative of our life is there, and every single person has a narrative of that, right? So everyone you meet, and then you co-create narratives with people. You always check and make sure you're on the same page about what you're
Yeah.
creating, but also like existentially you could never actually be on the same page because you're locked in your own head. So we're creating our own narratives and our story. There's a lot of stories from culture, that say like
Hmm.
you get married, you have kids, this is how you have happiness. And, then you step outside of our white Western culture and you realize there's other paradigms around that, of how to do this. And so once you get to that space where you're like, okay, like what story do I want to write today? You get that
Yes.
freedom to choose that, which is scary because it's like coming up to a blank canvas and being like, wow, okay, there's no colors, there's no lines, there's no dots to connect. Which one do I want? Like that's a lot of
Yeah.
freedom.
Yeah.
But also then there's like we're talking about, then there's that additional next level, right? Of like, cool, like what narratives do I want to play with? What
Yeah.
narratives do I actively want to have fun, pick up, and then put away, right? And
Yes.
hence where your D&D skills come into,
Yeah.
and where I struggle because that D&D was hard. I played once and was like, I can't get into
Yeah.
this.
It is
Improv is
difficult.
so difficult for me, but I'm getting better. It's a practice
Yeah.
of discomfort, right?
It is
So
definitely.
totally. So it's like, what narrative do I want to play with today?
Mhm.
What narrative sparks my fantasies and gets me, up and excited that I can have in this container and then maybe never again. Who
Yeah.
knows?
Yeah, seriously. And like I love unpacking those fantasies as well because I do think that everything is more than just the surface level. I'm gonna dress up as a fairy princess and my partner is gonna dress up as a I don't know, a dungeon lord. I don't find
Yeah,
making
yeah,
up
yeah.
weird shit.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's like, okay, well what's the thread there that I was drawn to? Or like in a D&D session, what did I have the most fun with and what about it was something I can recreate in other play, whether in like a role play, their costume involved situation, or even in just a specific sex act, right? Like what
Mm-hmm.
about that can I want to pull on the thread and explore it. When I talk to people about media literacy, and that's a topic I talk about a lot, but just like when you think about consuming different media and you're drawn to or stimulated by something, what about it? Like pull on that thread and think about it critically, right? That's what media literacy is all about. But pull on that thread and like think about ways to explore it in your life because you don't have to rely just on the escapism of media, right? You can
Mm-hmm.
recreate those elements in your own sexual experience, but it does require the critical thinking and the time to explore what that fantasy is, or what that feeling is, whether a sensation or an emotional reaction. I feel like that's the fucking fun, right? Like
Yeah.
that's literally the whole point is like every day I want to be asking questions about like why do I like that or what
Yeah.
didn't I like about that? And I do think like I was forced to ask myself those questions when processing trauma, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not everyone has the catalyst for those thoughts, but I do think we should all be seeking to think through them. But it is uncomfortable. And to be fair, I also did improv in college, so I am 100% that bitch. But it's still like all of that stuff is like sometimes is cringy and awkward, but like it's
Totally.
about having like the right partners for the right
For
situation.
sure, for
Yeah.
sure, for sure. Yeah, I was taking like chemistry and physics where it was like right answer, nothing
Yeah.
strays, Like so the idea of going out and just being like improv is like
Yeah.
deeply terrifying.
Yeah, no, my degree is in communication and art history. So I was all
Amazing.
over the fucking, yeah, all over the
Yeah,
fucking map.
for sure, for sure. And I agree with you in terms of the, exploration of the I was gonna say like Pandora's box. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like what the hell is up here in the psyche? It has been the most fascinating adventure of my lifetime to try and understand that. And knowing that given kind of what we were talking about narratives, right? Like we're at a space right now where things excite us. As we continue to get more information, our narratives will shift and what will excite us will shift. And so it's never an end point, right? We're always going to
Yeah.
be exploring what it is that turns us on erotically and what doesn't. And it's going to shift. But if we look back to those old days, like, man, I used to get off on the idea of like marrying a pastor, having 4 kids by
Hmm.
20, and being a submissive housewife that stayed at home. We
The
have
visceral reaction my body had.
I know. I'm like, I have to remember that, like, like, and I think this is where it gets tricky
Yeah.
about like the identity stuff of like, oh, that's my
Yes.
identity and who I am. And it's like, oh my God, like that was shifted and created by my environment. And where I'm at right now, I am just a product of my environment, people. You know what I mean? And where
Yes.
I will be a deeper product of my environment. So it's like, I think we do have to ask deeper critical questions, if the only way that you can get off is by degrading women. I don't know. I ask deeper
Yeah.
questions if that's the only way. If it's a way versus multiple different ways, like
Yeah.
why is that the only way
Yeah. Like what's
that
going
you
on there? Let's
yeah, the
Yeah.
only because
Yeah.
I'm there for it, but the only again, if you
Yeah.
can only have fun at the party when you're drinking alcohol,
What's up?
what's
Yeah.
up? What's up? Let's talk about that. I mean, it is fun. Don't get me wrong.
For
Alcohol is
sure.
fun, but that's the
Sure.
only way you have
The
fun.
only way. Yeah, there's something to unpack. What are we
Mm.
hiding from?
And that is not alcohol shamey. That is not kink
No.
shamey. We're just asking
No.
deeper questions about the context.
Totally. Yeah. There are so many times in my life where I was like, I won't do this, or
Mm.
I'll only do this, or like these things are off the list, or these are the only things I'm. And really now I'm an open book, but
Yeah.
there is a critical lens to all of this. You can't just fuck without thinking about it, though we all do try sometimes. But there are thoughts to be had about all of it. And I think like if you let yourself like lean into the fun of it, it's worthwhile, even when you have to ask yourself the hard questions or ask other people the hard questions.
Right. Yeah. Because I think a big one for the majority of women is, oh, I see my man crying. That's unattractive.
True. In my world, I felt like that conversation has come up, or in media, it's come up more and more lately, which is so weird because to me, it feels like such an outdated,
Oh,
like arch
totally.
like archaic notion of masculinity and femininity. But yeah, I feel like I recently have been like, oh my, like I saw him cry or he cried at this thing and it was like so weird. And I'm like, why was it weird? I don't know about you, but I cry all the time. Happy
Right.
tears, sad tears, and like he can do whatever the fuck he wants. It's not gonna like turn me on. It's just like, why are certain expressions of emotion associated with masculinity or femininity? And it's just, yeah, it's one of those things that makes sense. It's just still mind blowing.
Totally. And I think that's exactly like the point here then of like, we want to be open to all the different things that turn us on and move us and like not shame ourselves for those things. And also, we can't just have that experience of being like, oh, this man cried, I'm not attracted to him anymore, and be like, that's just who I am as an identity, is that I'm just not attracted to like weak men. It's like, you have to
Yeah.
understand that you are a product of your environment and that
Yeah.
lack of eroticism is so deeply laden with systems of oppression that we will continually go through unpacking of for the rest of our lives. So like enjoy your eroticism, but like have a critical lens to the ways that
Yes.
it's shaping what turns you on.
Yes, 100%. I mean, I'm lucky in that I met my partner organically and didn't have to deal with the nuance of
Mm,
dating apps,
yeah.
which I have used before, obviously, but I feel like it comes up a
Yeah.
lot when we think about dating apps. Like, oh, this gave me
Mhm.
the ick. And I'm like, it's a pretty superficial way to get to know someone. And I mean, again, sometimes things do just give you the ick. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes I've seen messages that my friends get. I'm like, that's icky. No, thank you. But sometimes it is that, right? It is the societally structured response to what we've been told is an ick. I'm like, maybe that person's just being genuine. And if so, like, if that genuine element of that person isn't going to be compatible with your genuine essence, then fine. Then fine. But maybe we should unpack, right, some of what our reactions are, configured by our societal programming as opposed to just our inherent reactions to things.
Which is then I think also complicated when you think about like the so if we're talking about like the discomfort of challenging those things, and it's like, oh, this is uncomfortable, and then like you never obviously want to force your body and soul to be intimate with someone that gives you the ick, or in that way, like, like it's like that gets a tricky space of like, I can see my bias right there.
Yeah.
How do I unpack this in ways that aren't forcing my body to like be with someone that gives me the ick, but I also know that this is a bias and I can see it's a bias. I think that's a tricky dance of like unpacking that through
Yeah.
time. And I think at least in my own experience, that's really what it's been, is like obviously never forcing my body to do something, but getting curious about it, growing through conversations and community about it.
Yes.
And then eventually that ick kind of has shifted into other spaces now where I don't have it and it's there, but it's just, it really is a tricky dance, I think, in terms of the discomfort when we're dismantling the ways that these systems impact our eroticism. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the same note, but flipping it on its head, like the things that we do experience as attractive or arousing, and we feel shame about them because they're associated with something we've been programmed to think we're not supposed to, right? And so I
Yeah.
think like it's twofold. The things that our response is configured and should be unpacked versus the things that we pretend we don't have a response to at all. But that's why opening up on all fronts and exploring is so important. And for me, like I had a lot of shame about enjoying being submissive immediately following my sexual assault because
Mm,
I was like, I'm an empowered person
yeah.
and I should never want to be in a situation like that again. Why am I able to get off in a situation where I'm being more submissive than not? Right. And
Mm,
so it's like, that's one specific instance in my life. Life is comprised of countless experiences. And I think that there can easily be shame about, oh, I didn't like the situation, but there's something about it that I keep coming back to that's okay to unpack. But like so much of it is understanding what drives the response, and is it something genuine to who you are as an individual, or is it something
Mm-hmm.
that's constructed?
Yeah. Yeah. And the frame to all of it too, right? Because like when you're bottoming or subbing, like you are the empowered partner in that dynamic, right? So it's like, what's the frame to how we're looking at this? Is this like a powerless state where I'm giving up stuff? Or is it the reality that that Dom can't do shit until you give them the green light?
Yes.
So you are the empowered one on that bottom there. You are the one controlling the scene. You are the
Yes.
one who draws the line at any point that you want it to be drawn, right? Which
Yes.
does have that empowerment of like, I am letting go to you so that you can actually service me
Mm-hmm.
here. Okay. So it's like,
Yeah.
even that frame of like, how do we look at it will shift whether we have that deeper shame about it or whether it goes into that narrative of empowerment, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I so try to explain that to people who aren't in the kink and fetish communities, because
Um,
it's tough. But like when I have friends even
yeah.
who were like, I don't understand the appeal of BDSM. That's always like the one that people use, because 50 Shades of Grey is sometimes the closest anyone's ever gotten to being like
Sure.
kink community adjacent, which
Sure.
I try to unpack that as well.
Yeah.
But they're like, I don't understand why anyone would want to be dominated completely
Hmm.
or something. And I'm like, that's interesting. Well, let's talk about it. And the frame that you just described is part of what I try to drive home, is that for people who are fearful of submission because of the presumed implications they think it'll have on them, or because they want to maintain a sense of autonomy or agency, understanding that in consenting kink and fetish dynamics, you have control, even if your role in that play is to relinquish some control, right? But you always are maintaining wholehearted consent, right? Again, if you're structuring your dynamic and your play the way that I hope everyone is, but you have that autonomy, like you said, and the end goal should be autonomous pleasure in those situations. But I think it's hard for people to understand if they're not open to understanding what elements of different types of play they can incorporate in their own. But I mean, again, it's asking the right questions, or trying to expand your own mindset, and it's an uncomfortable thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm just like trying to think of examples because I think there's a lot of different ways that we do that in our life where it's like, please plan this surprise party for me. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I'm going to hand over the power for you to create this world for me so that I don't have to
Yes.
do it and I'm just going to show up to the party and have fun. Like,
Yeah.
it's just interesting how that like dynamic, you know, of like
Yeah.
it's so empowering when you're able to like let go and know that it's your container, it's your
Yeah.
party. You could leave at any point. They throw a great surprise party, but you're like, I'm done. You're not forced to stay, you know, because
Yeah.
the opposite of that is abuse, right? And so then it's
Yes.
not kink. The opposite of dom, where you have no power, is abuse, right?
Yes.
That is
Yeah.
not what we do. So it's like, but like you said, like trying to get people to see that frame and understand that world, I think is part of the dynamic, which is why I think this conversation between two women, right, in the space is super empowering because, you know, do have conversations about doming with other women. They're like, oh, I would never like want to be a sub because like that's like, you know, so much of what I experience in the world. And I'm like, you're missing the
Mm-hmm.
frame, like you're
Yeah.
missing the empowerment of it. And yeah, maybe do it with another woman and then see how you feel about it,
Yeah.
right? Because you might feel really
Totally.
different when you do it with another woman or any gender, right? Like all these different pieces here. It's about seeing a whole new world. Cute Disney, right? Like a whole new world of
Yeah.
options of play. You know, when society has taught you such a small space of what is possible, to start realizing, whoa, wow.
It's a world of self-discovery.
Yeah,
Like
it
that's a
is.
thing. And I feel like if you open yourself up to it, you can take things that you learn about yourself in a sexual context and apply them to your day to day. And
Hell
I don't
yeah.
think like I think that there's a correlation between the way I see myself in the workplace and the way that I've explored myself sexually, right?
Yeah.
Not to say that I'm taking on the exact same role in the workplace, but elements of who I am and how I present or choose to present to certain people or respond to a certain dynamic has shifted over time, and it's all interwoven, right?
Hmm.
It's all about the greater strive towards personal and collective growth.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just validate the hell out of that. Like as a
Yeah.
psychologist in training, I will validate the hell out of that. That how you learn how to play shifts the other aspects of your life, right? And so then hence we go back to that conversation we were having earlier about like starting in a subspace, or just like developing this dom part of ourself as we developed maybe more empowerment, trust of ourselves, etc. Like these things are not separate as like hardcore identities as much as they're created through our experience of life and how we see ourselves and etc. So
Yeah. Yeah. It can be difficult to be open to that, but I think it's important.
totally.
Something I've unpacked in therapy. So
And something I will keep taking my dear listeners through in this space, baby.
Yes, I love it.
Yeah. So I have two questions I want to ask you.
Okay.
So the first question is, what would you want to say to your younger self if you could like take a moment just to call her to mind and really like see her, and you can pinpoint like wherever that is in your journey. Maybe it's all the way back to high school, maybe it's, you know, somewhere in college or afterwards. Just like, who is that person and what would you want to say to her?
What I would say is it will get easier, but you do have to put in more effort than you're willing to right now. And it will be difficult, but in the end, putting work into anything will, in the long run, benefit you and make life easier. And I would say, stick it out. On the bad days, just remember that they won't always be bad. And also that your body is your own and don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
Yeah. Such wise words. And yeah, that path is bumpy. It has been a bumpy. Yeah, you're like,
it's been a bumpy fucking life. For sure.
Yeah, but the empowerment when you continue to go on that bumpy ride of growth, right? The discomfort of growth and continue to go on it, and the empowerment, the enlightenment that you feel on that other side. Wouldn't trade it for anything, right?
No, yeah, it was worth all of the fucking journey. For sure.
Yeah. And before I ask the last question, I want to hold some space too in case there was anything maybe you wanted to say to the listeners that we didn't get to. Otherwise, I can draw us towards our closing question.
I think the only other thing I'll say is to other survivors of sexual trauma or sexual abuse that it's scary to confront the lingering shadows of that, even after you've processed the event itself. It is one of many life events that continues to have an ongoing impact. But at the same time, I want to empower every survivor to know that it doesn't have to be your entire identity, that there's so much more to you than that one experience. And I hope that all of us can continue to explore what and who we are as a person outside of that can be as life moves on.
Totally. I'm like, okay, second hour of podcast. Here we go. How do we, you know what I mean? Like, to leave that, not,
I'll come back and talk about
it. Totally. Because there is a whole other side once you kind of like not leave that identity behind, but like leave that identity behind.
Yeah.
To make new ones.
Yes. Yeah. That's another part of the fucking bumpy journey.
Yeah, I'm right there with you.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah. Well, then, if you feel good, we'll go towards our closing question. Okay. So the one question that I ask everyone on the podcast is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it is, at least in the context of some of what we've been talking about, it is so much more normal to fantasize about yourself in roles that you don't wish were reality. It's incredibly normal to have those fantasies and explore them and discover that you don't actually like them in practice, and that's okay. And I think that goes back to the exploration. It's normal to want to try something and not like it, and that's a learning moment, and there's nothing wrong or shameful about having had the thought or wanting to try it.
Yeah. Sometimes I don't like that chocolate chip cookie and I want ice cream. You know what I mean? We don't like beat ourselves up for taking the bite and then being like, nah, you know what I mean?
That's so true. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think a lot of, and then for like 5 years down the line, be like, actually, that chocolate chip cookie sounds really good. And then like 2 years later again, nope, we don't do chocolate. We don't do chocolate. You know, that's the journey, right?
Yes.
That's the journey.
Yes. Changing your mind. Human turns out. So weird.
What a thought. Well, it was such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Yeah. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, I had an absolute blast. It was great chatting again. Would love to keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
Have you on mine, be on yours. And yeah, folks listening, Sexistentialist podcast, check it out.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask
Yeah,
next. Like,
the
where can
plug.
people find you? Plug away. Yeah.
Yeah, so on Instagram at Sexistentialist Pod, it's existentialist with an S at the front. Bit of a mouthful, but yeah, Sexistentialist is on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you can listen to podcasts. We cover lots of topics, so I'm sure there's something for you. But if you have any podcasts questions or requests, I do open my DMs every once in a while on Instagram, so feel free to shoot me a note.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nicole, and thanks everyone listening.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.